Supreme Court has already, in essence, spoken out against the president. Earlier today, they indicated that they will not hear the president's appeal in the E. Jean Carroll sexual abuse case. Remind us what that case was about and what the Supreme Court's decision to not dive into it means.
Right. So there were two lawsuits that were filed by the president against E. Jean Carroll. And this one had to do, by E. Jean Carroll against the president. Mm-hmm. And this one had to do with defamation and sexual assault, a federal court in New York, and a jury there found him liable civilly for both, and it was a $5 million verdict. The other case is still pending and going forward, which is the one that is the larger monetary remedy. And so the question before the Supreme Court, or what they were trying to get, but the president was trying to get the Supreme Court to weigh in on, were a bunch of issues, but the two main ones were that the court allowed women who were not, who were alleging sexual assault, their testimony, even though they were not the subject of this particular lawsuit. So that's an evidentiary question. And then there was another question about, if you remember, the Access Hollywood tape and the admissibility of that tape that had the president's sort of bragging about his ability to control women in certain ways and grab them, and that, he was claiming was irrelevant and prejudicial. And
this is not just another courtroom update. This is the moment Donald Trump's delay strategy may finally be running out of road. For years, Trump's legal team fought the E. Jean Carroll case at every level. They challenged the verdict. They appealed the ruling. They pushed the fight higher and higher until it reached the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court finally looked at Trump's request, it refused to step in. That decision changed everything. Because now, the $5 million judgment from the first Carroll case is no longer just a number on paper. The money has been sitting in a court-supervised escrow account while the appeals played out. And because interest has continued to grow, that $5 million has climbed to about $5.8 million. Now Judge Lewis Kaplan is moving toward the moment Trump has been trying to avoid: payment. And that is why this ruling matters.
And so these were issues that were, contentious, but the Supreme Court has decided that it's not worth it for it to weigh in these cases. And once again, the Supreme Court gets to choose which cases it hears based on, what it thinks is it's important to weigh in on. So that means this verdict stands, and the president will have to pay this amount of money to E. Jean Carroll.
So in your mind, does this decision effectively settle this question nationwide? Or are there still, statutory arguments that states or even the president or political parties could raise in future litigation?
Yeah, absolutely. It will still continue to be litigated, because the Supreme Court hasn't said, by not agreeing to hear the case, they haven't said there are no issues or we agree with the way that this court came out. All it's saying is that we don't want to hear this case. We just are not prioritizing it. We're a court of limited jurisdiction, and we're only hearing a handful of cases compared to how many people file writs asking for us to weigh in. And so there is no precedential value to it determining that it will not hear this case, and future cases can come out differently. But the one thing that we know is that this case is over.
This case began when a federal jury in New York heard the evidence, reviewed the testimony, and found Donald Trump liable for sexual abuse and defamation against E. Jean Carroll. The jury awarded her $5 million. Trump's team said they would appeal. So the case went to the Court of Appeals. Judges reviewed the trial, the evidence, the legal arguments, and the rulings from Judge Kaplan's courtroom. And after all of that, the appeals court said the verdict would stand. Trump's team then went to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court refused to take the case. That should have ended it. But instead, Trump's lawyers asked for more time. They argued that the lawyer who handled the appeal was no longer available and that a new lawyer needed time to catch up. But here is the problem with that argument. There is almost nothing left to catch up on.
Also, Laura, we did get other news this morning out of the Supreme Court rejecting President Trump's attempt to overturn the verdict in his civil case involving E. Jean Carroll. What did the Supreme Court say here?
Yeah, so here, remember, it was a $5 million verdict after a trial. E. Jean Carroll had actually won that case. It was for defamation and sexual abuse. President Trump had wanted the highest court to weigh in there to take up the appeal. Today, they refused to weigh in, denying his attempt to take up that appeal. They didn't provide any explanation, as they normally don't if they're going to deny cert in this case, but it means that E. Jean Carroll has now definitively won that case, and there can be no further appeals of that case now that the highest court has weighed in.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.
The trial is over. The appeal is over. The Supreme Court has already refused to intervene. The only thing left is one final attempt to ask the Supreme Court to reconsider a decision it just made. And that almost never works. Judge Kaplan appears to understand exactly what is happening. He has watched this case from the beginning. He has seen the motions, the appeals, the delays, and the attempts to stretch the process as long as possible. But every legal process has an endpoint, and in this case, that endpoint is getting very close.
I want to bring in MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin. Lisa, you literally just left the courtroom. You were there for the exchange we just talked about. We can read it, but you saw it. What did you see?
So, Chris, let's go back to even before the exchange. I did see at least one of the exchanges that the plaintiff's counsel was complaining about. Former President Trump had a bunch of very noticeable reactions. I'm sitting in the right-hand side of the courtroom in the back, so I have a diagonal view of former President Trump talking to his counsel. I did see him, for example, when the May 10th, 2023 Truth Social video was played in the courtroom, where he calls the verdict an absolute disgrace. I witnessed him mouth to Alina Habba, "That's true. I heard it as well." So Sean Crowley stood up for E. Jean Carroll, complained about 3 statements that former President Trump had made that were audible to those at the plaintiff's table, and she said must have been audible to the jury as well. That's when Judge Kaplan, for the second time today, reminded former President Trump that he should not be making comments that the jury could hear or that even audience members could hear, and then said, "You have a right to attend. You do not have the right to be disruptive or to disregard court orders. I hope that I do not have to remove you from the courtroom." And that's when Trump, just as Judge Kaplan said, couldn't help himself and said, I know that you would like nothing more. I know you really want to do that. And Kaplan, more in sorrow than in anger, shook his head and said, "You just can't help yourself in these circumstances, can you?" And then Kaplan walked off the bench. I have the feeling, Chris, knowing Judge Kaplan and how he's controlled his courtroom so far, this isn't the last we've heard of it. And it's likely that we won't have to see another outburst from former President Trump for Judge Kaplan to revisit this subject. He has had very firm control of his courtroom in contrast to Judge Engoron. Multiple times he has said to Alina Habba things like, "If you don't have an objection, sit down. You're not here to make announcements." He is a person who's very intent on keeping control in his courtroom and for the most part has done it well so far.
The money is already secured. It is not theoretical. It is not hidden. It is not something Carroll has to chase through a separate process. It is sitting in escrow waiting for the court to release it. That is why Trump's delay strategy is now backfiring, because every day he delayed, the interest kept running. The original $5 million is now about $5.8 million, and that is only the smaller judgment. The second Carroll verdict, worth $83.3 million, is also still hanging over Trump, and with interest growing on that number too, the total is moving closer and closer to $100 million. That is the part Trump cannot spin away. Delay may have helped him control headlines for a while. It may have helped him buy time. It may have helped him turn a courtroom loss into a political talking point. But financially, delay has become expensive. He delayed. The meter ran. Now the bill is getting bigger. But this story is not only about money. It is about power. It is about accountability. And it is about whether the legal system can still force powerful people to face consequences after a jury has spoken.
And yet there's obviously some, what we can say in layman's terms, is crazy there. But I want to go back to something I heard you say in the very early hours this morning. I think it was on way too early, Lisa. So pardon me if I'm misquoting you, but it really struck me that you said something like, this is really about how much money is it going to take to shut up Donald Trump, right? And that's going to go back in large part, non-lawyer speaking, to the credibility of E. Jean Carroll on the stand. So you've been there, you've listened to her. Tell us what you think.
You know, I was at this first trial first, Chris, and I will say 2 things. One, There is no such thing as a perfect sexual assault victim. And if we're expecting perfection, E. Jean Carroll's not going to meet that standard. In fact, there are multiple circumstances in which she presented a face to the public that is at odds with the person who was receiving death threats, who was fearful for her life. And I thought her lawyer, Robbie Kaplan, did a nice job this morning of what lawyers, and Danny knows this well, call taking the sting out of some of those admissions, asking her to acknowledge that, for example, when she gave media interviews surrounding the publication of her book and said that she was doing well and felt like she was in a cocoon of love and support, that wasn't entirely true, that while she had received meaningful messages of support, she was also dealing with things like death threats that Robbie had gone through with her already. I think E. Jean Carroll is a credible plaintiff, but that doesn't mean that she is a perfect one. She is a person who has oftentimes done things that are somewhat at odds with what people, particularly people who don't know sexual assault and trauma victims, might expect people to say or do in the moment. But I thought E. Jean Carroll did a good job of explaining that there is a public E. Jean and a private E. Jean. And the public E. Jean was raised to be a buoyant cheerleader who was always cheering people on, knew all the answers, gave advice, and the private E. Jean was quiet, contemplative, and increasingly a person who is living with fear. And she said, I've gotten to know that E. Jean better, and I like her.
E. Jean Carroll first came forward years ago. She was attacked, mocked, and accused of lying. She went through a legal battle. Most people would never have the money or stamina to survive. But 2 juries heard her case, and both times, Trump lost. That matters because this was not a political commentator making a claim on television. This was not an opinion poll. This was not a cable news argument. This was a jury verdict. Then it was reviewed by appellate judges. Then the Supreme Court refused to disturb it. And now Judge Kaplan is preparing to enforce it. That is what makes this moment so important. For Trump, the most dangerous part is not just that he lost. It is that the loss is becoming real. A courtroom defeat is one thing. A headline is one thing. A judgment sitting on paper is one thing. But money leaving escrow and going to Carroll is different. That is enforcement. And enforcement is the part that powerful people fear most. Because once the court actually moves the money, the message becomes impossible to ignore. Even a former president cannot delay forever. But there is a deeper political question underneath this case.
An appeals court has just upheld the $83 million defamation judgment E. Jean Carroll won against President Trump. Let's go live right now to CNN's Kara Scannell. Kara, the president lost the appeal, so what happens now?
Well, the president did lose this appeal, and he already set aside money in order to pay E. Jean Carroll, but the litigation here is most likely not over. Donald Trump's lawyers releasing a statement in which they said that they will continue to fight this, and that they said the defense will be taken over by the Department of Justice. This was a civil lawsuit that was brought against President Trump when he was out of office. It went to trial when he was out of office, but now he is saying it should be handled by the Justice Department as this moves forward. Now, the next step here would be a challenge to the U.S. Supreme Court. That is certainly something that the Trump administration can attempt to do, and it would be up to the justices to decide whether to hear this. But you'll remember this was the big judgment against Donald Trump as he was a candidate, brought by E. Jean Carroll, the magazine columnist who said that he had sexually assaulted her in a New York department store in the mid-1990s. And she went on trial twice. The first time, a jury found that Trump had sexually abused her and had defamed her when he denied the assault, when he said that she wasn't his type, and when he said that she made up the claim to boost sales of her book. That jury awarded her $5 million. Then they also had a second lawsuit that went to trial that was just focused on the defamation. And it's that decision, that is this $83.3 million verdict, that the jury had awarded Carroll. Now, in this, the judges here pointing out that even though the big chunk of that $65 million was for punitive damages, that means to punish Trump. The judges saying that they were upholding this even though it was very high compared to a ratio of compensatory damages, because it was so extraordinary and unprecedented, because Trump had continued to repeat the statements that a jury had already found to be defamatory within 48 hours after the verdict at a CNN town hall and then during the trial itself. So that is the basis for which this appellate panel is saying that they are upholding this verdict. Next steps will be to see if the Supreme Court is asked to take up the case, and if they do. Wolf?
All right, we'll see what happens. Kara Scannell reporting for us. Kara, thank you very much.
Some of Trump's former lawyers are now sitting in powerful positions inside the American legal system. D. John Sauer, who argued Trump's presidential immunity position, is now Solicitor General. Todd Blanche, another Trump lawyer, has held a major role at the Justice Department. Justin Smith, who worked on Trump's legal team, became a federal appeals judge. That does not automatically mean anyone will interfere in the Carroll case. The money is already in escrow, and this civil process is mostly insulated. But it raises a serious question for the future. What happens in the next case? What happens when the money is not already secured? What happens when enforcement depends on institutions filled with people who were once personally connected to Trump's defense? That is why this case is bigger than one payment. The law is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. A verdict means very little if nobody has the courage or independence to make it real. And that is exactly what Judge Kaplan's courtroom is testing right now. There are three possible paths from here.
All right, breaking news for you now. An appeals court has just ruled in favor of E. Jean Carroll in her $83 million defamation lawsuit against President Trump. The court ruled against the president's attempt to throw the case out entirely. He had argued that he deserved presidential immunity given the timing of the original verdict, which you recall happened back in January of 2024. Carroll claimed her reputation was severely damaged after the president denied her claim that she was raped in 1996. The more than $83 million award included more than $18 million in emotional and reputational damages and $65 million in punitive damages. No word yet on the president's reaction. We'll let you know if he does have one.
The first is simple. Trump pays. Carroll receives the $5.8 million, and Trump keeps fighting the larger $83.3 million judgment while interest continues to grow. The second is more dramatic. Trump's team tries another delay tactic, Judge Kaplan rejects it, and the court moves the money directly from escrow without waiting for Trump to cooperate. The third is the larger political fight. This case becomes a warning about what happens when legal accountability collides with political power. No matter which path happens, one thing is clear. The clock is running out. Trump appealed. Trump delayed. Trump asked the higher courts to rescue him. But the appeals court rejected his arguments. The Supreme Court stepped aside, and Judge Kaplan is now moving toward enforcement. That is why this moment matters. Because for years, Trump has acted as if every legal defeat could be delayed, appealed, reframed, or buried under another headline. But this case shows the limit of that strategy. At some point, the motions end. At some point, the appeals run out. At some point, the court stops waiting. And when that happens, the bill comes due. For E. Jean Carroll, that moment appears closer than ever. For Trump, it is another legal defeat turning into a financial reality. And for the country, it is a test of something much bigger. Can the law still reach the most powerful people in America? Judge Kaplan's answer appears to be yes. No more endless delays, no more excuses, no more pretending the verdict does not exist. The money is there. The judgment is real. And now Trump may finally be forced to pay.